Greetings, social media land. This is Ted Victor, founder of the Broward Social Network. Today is June the 12th at approximately 3:50 in the afternoon. And we have, once again, someone who's been with us before, Mr. Dale June, who's out in California. So what time is it out there? It's approximately maybe 12:50 over there?
Exactly, 12:50.
12:50. Mr. June is an author. He's now a friend. And you can tell he's not African-American. He is a conscious thinker of what's going on today in America in response to the manifestations and the protests and the need for racial and social equity. And I'm going to ask him to introduce himself again. And I'd like for us to invite you to join this conversation on race in America with non-African Americans, with non-Black folks, because in order for us to move forward as a civil society, everyone must be part of this conversation towards civility. So Mr. June, Mr. Dale June, welcome back to the Broward Social Network in South Florida. How are you today?
I'm fine, sir. Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this opportunity, and I do want to thank you for it.
Thank you, and you're welcome. Introduce yourself to the platform, because thousands of people will see this interview, hundreds and thousands of people will see this interview, and now more than ever, I am particularly interested in finding out what's on the mind of mainstream Americans who are not necessarily Black, who are not necessarily African American. And even though you probably may not be able to speak for all white Americans, but you are a white American in America, and I'd like for you to introduce yourself first and then talk about what's on the minds of a non-Black American at this time in June when folks are manifesting, when folks are demonstrating in protesting in the streets of the United States and all over the world. So introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yes, I'm a professor at National University in Los Angeles. Plus also I teach at two other universities, and one of them, of course, is being Compton College in Compton, California. And I've had a long career in law enforcement, including my military and teaching experience. It comes to almost, or maybe even a little over 50 years being involved in law enforcement matters, teaching and as an active participant.
Okay.
I have a master's degree from George Washington University, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to publish, I think, my 13 books.
Okay. Mr. June, talk to us about your upbringing. Talk to us where you're from. Talk to us about your travels before we talk about where you are today as a person, because all of those experiences has culminated into the thinker that we have before us today. So talk about where you're from, where your parents from. Talk about your background.
Okay, yeah, very good. I was born and raised in a very, very small town in Western New York. It's a very rural area with lots of farming and all of that going on. I was very fortunate to have good neighbors and all. Unfortunately, I was never exposed to a Black person as a friend or whatever. I believe that there were only just a few Black people in the whole county. But I was also fortunate that when I was 14, 15, and 17, I actually would get up early in the morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, and hitchhike to a farm across the border in Pennsylvania. It was a produce farm. And on this produce farm, I worked in the fields with, in fact, I was just about, I think, the only white person in the fields. All of the other workers there were Black. They were from the South. They were migrant workers. They would come north every year and work in the fields. So we'd hit the field just about daylight and walk down these endless lines of cauliflower and picking up the leaves of the cauliflower and tying them up so that other people behind us could use machetes and cut the leaves off and then put them into the crates for shipping. I had a great opportunity to involve myself in the lives of those people, and the fact that I made one really good friend who unfortunately ended up being murdered there in one of those camps, one of the immigrant camps. But one of the memories I have the most is that there was a company store on the farm. And of course, I was told not to go in there by the field boss because they didn't want the whites. I was the only minority one there, but anyway, they didn't want us mixing and doing things like that. So of course, naturally, I went in and got to know the people in there, but I learned the culture a lot. But one thing I remember about the place, this is where they could buy, essentials for the day and, a few groceries and whatever. But it was a joy to me, as I said, to be able to be exposed to that and to the culture. And then, well, I was getting, as a 14-year-old white boy, I was getting paid $1 an hour. The other workers, the migrants, and of course, supporting the families, I mean, the entire family would come. And they were getting paid, especially the ones who were working in the bean fields, they were getting paid 35 cents per bushel of beans. And I thought, wow, here I was making $14 a day. And they were lucky to make even maybe $10 a day or whatever it was and less. And then on Saturday, the field boss would arrive in his brand new purple Lincoln and pay the field hands. And of course, when he paid them, it was minus what they owed at the store, which usually just left them basically nothing. And of course, I thought that was outrageous, but I did, as I said, I learned, I probably can't do it so much now, but I actually learned to talk the talk and all of that. And so as I say that, of course, I left out the story of the year that I was 16. The year I was 16, I worked in a chicken slaughterhouse, pulling the insides out of the chickens. And that was another 12-hour day. So,
but let's slow down a little bit, Mr. June. Why would your parents let you work with Black people? I thought Black people worked in one place and white people worked in another place. Why were you working alongside with Black people, with Black people?
Excellent question, sir. Basically, they had no qualms about that at all. They just thought that was part of my growing up, part of my experience and things that I should know.
So your parents are from what part of Europe? From England, from Spain?
Well, going back actually prior to the American Revolutionary War, yeah, they came from England, going clear back to there. But both my mother and my father taught me that all people are actually the same. Doesn't matter what color their skin.
Were you part of some sort of a religious community? What time? What era was this? 1950s, 40s?
20s. Did you say 20s?
What year?
Actually, yeah, it was in the 50s, in the 1950s, and.
But racism was big and well. I mean, so you're telling me that your parents were not racist?
Absolutely. In fact, no, I didn't belong to any religious group or anything special like that. It's just that they felt that, and my grandparents were the same way. At least on my mother's side, they believed in equality, and they never said anything bad about Black people at all. I never heard any discouraging words or whatever. The only thing that was important to them was that I was working hard.
Okay, but bear with me for a minute, Mr. June. Your neighbors, the community, you had to have heard that Black people at that time were not considered to be equal. You had to have heard that. I mean, you just told me that you were paid a dollar an hour and they were getting paid for 35 cents per bushel.
Yeah.
So the separation was evident.
Yeah, it was evident, but it was not an issue. That was the thing, and even in the town, which was, of course, a very small town, only 1,500 people at the time, and that was never an issue. I don't know if it was because there was one Black man that lived there, but everybody respected him and never called him any derogatory names or anything else. So I guess it was just a topic that was never talked about much.
That's amazing. That's amazing. But what about your neighbors? What about school? What about the rest of society? Go ahead.
Our neighbors, of course, we were spread out pretty good one thing and another. But of course, they were all white, and we were all white at the school. But again, it was just a small school. My graduating class only had 45 people in it. And again, it was basically a non-issue. Nobody ever talked about it until, of course, the civil rights movement came into the news in the 50s, and we started talking about down south where the kids were forbidden to go to school, and I mean, but again, that was something that was happening far away, so nobody actually got too involved with it. We talked about it. And we talked about the senior class that in the South that lost their senior year. And
when you say we talked about it, who talked about it? Your parents, your friends, your community?
No, my parents didn't talk about it very much, but we did at school. In fact, I had a class we called Problems of Democracy. And in that class, we talked about it. Again, it was a number of things, and we watched the newscasts and whatever, but we never really associated with the problems per se. Later on, in some instances, we did hear cases of rabble rousers going down south and causing problems in the South. The Philadelphia people that went down to Missouri, I believe, and were killed down there. We heard those stories, but again, you got to think about the fact that being a teenager in school, and it really didn't apply to us. So we just, that was just one of the things that was happening in the news far away.
But the other key point that the listeners must also pay attention, geography had a lot to play with it, because the fact that you said that you were in New York as opposed to Mississippi, I'm pretty sure that's a big difference at that time, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it was a very rural area also at the time. And, more people were concerned with daily living. It's even today, the county is a very, very poor county. And people were more concerned about earning a living and getting a good education. That's basically it, what we were most concerned about.
So at that time, would it have been permissible for a Black student to be a member of your class?
Oh, absolutely. He would have been welcomed, I'm sure.
Are you, come on, Mr. June, come on.
No,
Are you telling me at that time, it would have been easy for a Black guy like myself to say, hey, Dale, I want to be your classmate, and nobody in the community in the 1950s would have said anything that says, no, you cannot come to my class?
As weird as it may sound, but yeah, it's true. The people in that town are actually, extremely friendly people even today. And they welcome everyone. My next door neighbor was an American Indian. And she was just one of the few that, lived in the town. but and she was well known. In fact, when she died, she actually deeded her property to me because I had spent time with her hunting in the woods and things like this. And that's all the way it was. There was a community about 17 miles away that had a mixed population. And yeah, I could see that they were segregated at that time even. But as far as my town, my community, everybody was welcome.
Okay, so when you started working as a teenager and you had Black coworkers, was that in your town or was that in a different town?
No, yeah, that's what I was saying. It was in Pennsylvania. I'd actually, it was about, I don't know how many miles away, but I would have to hitchhike there early in the morning and get there.
From New York to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, from my town in New York into Pennsylvania, I'd have to, they would let me off on one side in New York, and then I'd walk across the bridge across the river into Pennsylvania, and then it was about a mile or 2 mile walk to the farm itself, wherein then we would board buses and be taken out to the fields.
There was no work in your hometown?
Oh no, not very little. Even today, there's very little work there. The town was actually founded on oil production, and when the oil started going out and the railroad left, there was really very little left there for people to do, and we had people working in stores. They may go to the towns on either side of us where there were some manufacturing and things, but for the most part, even my dad had to go over to another town about 17 miles away to work in a factory over there.
Did you have any siblings?
Yeah, we had a house full. I've got 3 older sisters and 2 younger brothers.
Okay, so family of 6, like the Brady Bunch, 3 boys, 3 girls, right?
Right, yeah, I'm right in the middle. I'm the oldest boy. We had 3 girls and then me and then the other 2 boys.
Okay, so what about your siblings? Are your siblings like-minded, whereby race was not an issue at that time?
I never thought so. I do, however, have one sister that I never knew that she was basically not necessarily racist, but she had a little problem with accepting the religion of my wife.
Okay, so she didn't have a problem with race, but she had a problem with religion?
Right. Yeah, that was the only thing. In fact, I had an aunt who lived in another town over who actually had a Black boyfriend.
Really?
And nobody thought anything about it. Just thought that was her.
Did they have children?
Pardon?
Did they have children?
No, but her daughter has a mixed race son.
Okay, so you have an aunt that has mixed grandchild?
Yeah. But that came from an entirely different episode. That it was not a, let's not say it was not a marriage or a love relationship.
Okay, all right, I understand. Okay, so you're working as a teenager and you go there from where? Where do you go from there?
Well, then from high school, I went into the military. And in fact, I went in the military the very next day after high school graduation.
What year was that?
1960.
Okay, 1960. Okay, 1960. Right. And where did you go? What countries did you travel to?
Germany.
Okay.
And then that is where I really came across. Now I went through basic training, and I had a number of black soldiers in not only in my platoon, but I had one in my squad, which is, only 10 of us. But, I made friends with him. We got along fine. It was really great. There was nothing there. I never saw any, well, I can't say I never saw anything, because sometimes the platoon sergeants would take out a little bit of, what would I say, take out a little bit of energy against the black soldiers.
Was
But,
was there segregation in that time and in those places?
No, segregation in the military forces was ended by President Truman in 1947.
Okay,
But
that's on paper, but it doesn't mean it doesn't mean
exactly.
socially that blacks and whites were integrated. So I'll ask you the question again. At that time, was there segregation between blacks and whites?
It was subtle. Platoon sergeants, many of them were from the South. And of course, you could see their aggression at that particular time, like extra duty and extra push-ups and all of that. And that was basic training. I didn't see it at military police school, which of course was in Georgia at the time. And I didn't actually experience it too much until I got overseas. And once I got over there, then it was very, very obvious of the segregation. There were a lot of course, GI bars and things, it was a major city. It was in Stuttgart, Germany. And, the white GIs could go any place that they wanted to. But the black GIs, they were relegated only to very, very specific places that they could go. There was one place right outside the barracks within walking distance that was entirely black. And I believe the name of it was called the Green Shack for some reason. But that was entirely black. No white soldiers would ever go there. And then when the German girls, any of the German girls who frequented that place or were even seen with a black person, they would never be dated by or asked to, or even talked to by white soldiers after that. It was a feeling that the black soldiers actually ruined them, if you will.
So you're at that time, you're what, 18, 19 years old?
Exactly, 18 years old when I first got there. And of course I left when I was 21.
Okay, so help me understand. Of course, your worldview will be different from my worldview, because as a non-black person, there's going to be certain social implication or social experiences that you're not going to be able to perceive accurately, because that's just not your worldview. What goes through the mind of Dale June at that time? Are you thinking that you need to say something? Are you thinking that this is wrong? Are you simply just accepting that blacks and whites are treated differently? What is your inner voice saying to you at that time?
Well, actually, there were total, I think, in my platoon, and we only had about 30 people there. But in my platoon, I think we had, including the supply sergeant, I think that there were actually only three other black MPs in that. And one of them I just really had, and I'm being frank, I had a very difficult time getting along with it, but not because of his color, but because my concept of doing good military police work was different from his. And that was the only thing. But the other two, in fact, one of them was from Jackson, Mississippi. And of course, he had gone through all of the problems in Jackson. And we became real good friends. I liked being with him because he was real funny. But aside from that, he would tell me some of his adventures and some of his life in Jackson. And in fact, one of them I remember was real funny because he was working in a restaurant with a white waitress in Jackson, right? And he was actually having a, how should I say? He was in a loving position with her, so to speak. You know, down behind the counter one night, and
Nice choice of words. Nice choice of words.
And so, as he was saying, you know, he kept saying to the girl, or the girl was saying to him, "Don't scream, don't scream."
Oh my goodness.
Because he knew what would happen.
Very interesting.
He was just really a great kid, you know. And I say we had a lot of adventures together.
So you stayed in the military for 4 years?
3 years.
3 years?
1960 to 1963.
You stayed in Germany, or you went through? It was
all right there in Germany. Yeah, that one base. Yeah.
So you stayed in Germany, and so you did not have the opportunity to see race relations in other countries.
Well, I did travel while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I did see that in some of the countries I went to, the black GIs were pretty much accepted in most of the places in the other countries. There was a lot of that. I recently watched a segment on television called Foyle's War. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's on Acorn Television. Mm-hmm. And if it's a book, it would be called a historical novel, because in every story they wove in some actual historical events. And part of that, one show, it showed the black GIs in England prior to and after the invasion of Europe, and how they were treated. And it was basically the same thing at that time. Of course, races in the military, this is 1946, 1947, they were still segregated. And the commanding officer of the troops actually asked the county or the city to build a bar specifically for black soldiers, so they would have someplace to go. And that was a white officer, but he was doing that to prevent intermingling in the regular English bars with whites and blacks.
So once again, so you see, going back to my question, so segregation was still very much alive and well back then.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just a matter of you know, seeing it and how it was. You know, I was mentioning the girls that went with black GIs and things. There was a very derogatory word for them. And as I say, once a girl went with a black man, black soldier, none of the white soldiers would have anything to do with her.
Okay. So after the military, you do what?
After the military, that's when I came to California. And I went to college. And
where did you go to college? Where did you go to college?
Well, I went to college in a small town in Northern California. Well, it was a small town then called Redding, California. And I went to Shasta College up there. Why
not go back home to your family in New York?
Well, there was really nothing there. There was no work or anything else like that. And I really couldn't afford to go to college. California, the community colleges were basically free at that time.
So they were offering more opportunities.
Exactly. Okay. And
so what was college like?
It was great. It was really great. Now, this is only a 2-year college. And so the times there were fine. I worked on the sheriff's department at the same time. The most of the, of course, Redding had a black population, but most of the people who came to our jail were actually American Indians that would come to town on weekends, coming out of the logging business or whatever, and then they would get drunk and have to be arrested or whatever. There was one person I remember, and I arrested him after I left the sheriff's department. I was on the Reading Police Department, and one person I arrested over and over and over again. And I just tell you this a little bit about him, but his first name was Reuben, and he would come, be arrested for drunkenness or whatever. And at that time, when I was working for the sheriff's department too, I would be booking him into jail. And then, as I say, when I was on the Reading Police Department, I would arrest him many times. And I got to know his first name very, very well.
This is Reuben, the African American, or the Native American?
Exactly.
Native American or African American?
Yeah, he was African American. And he came to jail, and they put him in there and locked him up. But later, years later, 2 or 3 years later, after I had I was at Sacramento State. I went to Sacramento State College, and I was going to college full time, and I was on the police department at the same time. Well, I told you about one little adventure that happened one night in the jail with this young airman. I told you that before, and I don't really want to go into it too much now. But that same captain, after I got off probation, see, he was also extremely prejudiced against college people, because he had only had an 8th grade education himself, and he didn't like college people. So he gave me an assignment that he thought was really going to punish me. He assigned me to a district, gave me my own car and a partner, and he gave me a district that was about maybe about 98% Black. And it was the toughest part of town. Of course, this during the civil rights and all the riots and everything else. And, he thought he was going to punish me, like I say. But I said in my mind, like Brer Rabbit, throw me to the briar patch, because he didn't know my background, the fact that I had spent so much time, my summers with Black people.
Right.
And he thought that I would be as prejudiced as anything else. Well, as it went along, my partner, his last name was Hannah, Hannah, and he was just a year younger than I was. And at that time, I was 24, as I told you earlier. I had just been married, and so he was 23.
You just had gotten married? You said you just had gotten married?
Yeah, he had just gotten married. Remember?
Oh, he got married. Okay.
Yeah, and my friend Jerry Hanna, we worked in that district, and we made a lot of friends. Believe me, we would stop in our patrol cars and our uniforms. We'd see people out working in the yard. We'd stop and talk to them about their flowers. We would stop and see boys playing basketball. We'd stop and play basketball with them for a little bit. And we'd spend a lot of time, basically what later became known as community policing. We got to know the people, really. Unbelievable. But we were invited to backyard barbecues and all of the other things like that. Well, one night we decided it was an off night. And so we decided we'd go out and do a little bit of partying ourselves. Well, where we went to was a total Black bar. We were the only people in this bar. And it was in the district where we worked. And so you can imagine, people knew we were police officers, and people knew that we were white. And so there was really no problem or anything, but there were a few people in there who started, looking at us and started talking about us, of course, and we expected that. And we were standing there, and a couple of them started walking towards us. All of a sudden, this one man came in front of us, and he turned around and he looked at the others and said, like this, "That is June, that is Hannah. You keep your hands off them. They are good people." And that was Reuben.
What, oh, because you had known Ruben from before.
Prior. Yeah, 3 years before, but he remembered me.
Hmm.
And because
So,
the way that I had treated him as a person, all the times that I arrested him and all the times that he was booked into the jail. And he was built about like you know, on that. He had a lot of muscles and they showed, but after that, we just had a great time. We were dancing, we were singing, we were getting drunk.
okay, so you were there for how long at that job?
At the job, I was there about 3 years.
And then what happens?
Oh, well, that happened. I graduated from college. As I said, I was going to college full time. Same time I was working full time on the police department. And then after I graduated from college, I left the police department and then went to work for Uncle Government.
But this is with a 2-year degree, right?
By the time I had a 4-year degree, I had a bachelor's degree.
And what did you major in?
It was at that time it was called public administration with a specialty in criminal justice.
Okay, but what about your classmates? Your classmates, any Black folks there?
I can't recall any. I know at Shasta there weren't any, but I can't recall. I can't
so
recall
the
any
university,
in Sacramento.
the university at that time, all white.
Well, there were Black students, but not in my particular classes. No.
Okay.
In fact, to tell you how, I guess, naive I was that my senior year, I had to take another science class. So I looked around to find the easiest one I could find, of course. And it was, it was an anthropology course, and it was called The Races of Man. And I said,
oh, I'm pretty sure that was pretty enlightening.
well, this is how naive I was. I said, well, how hard can this class be? There are only 3, Caucasian, Negroid, and Oriental.
Right. Right. So you thought it was an easy A.
Well, I did get the A, but it wasn't easy.
Okay. So what did you learn during that class?
Well, one thing that really stuck out a lot was a thing that I learned about sickle cell anemia and how that affects primarily Black men. And so I learned about that. And of course, I also learned that there were not 3 races of man, but over 100, and that a race is a social construct. It's only, say race, only to help identify people, because everything else is the same.
So talk a little bit more about that, because what are you thinking at that time? You're thinking that there are minor differences, there are major differences. Talk about that a little bit more.
Well, that was the only thing that I really learned was of the major difference was sickle cell anemia, and I learned about that. And then I learned that it was a thing that was called thalassemia, also, I believe, and another name called Mediterranean fever. And as it was when my youngest brother was born, he had thalassemia. And I don't know from where that came. My mother said that going way, way, way back, some of our ancestors may have lived near the Mediterranean area. But thalassemia was basically the same as sickle cell anemia. So I don't know from where it came. But those are the 2 things that I learned the most in that class.
So what are you thinking at that time? Are you thinking the fact that your brother had this blood disorder, that you guys could possibly have some Black ancestors? Is that what you're thinking? Very possible.
Well, actually, if we all go back far enough, we all have that.
We're one family. We're one family.
Exactly.
As a matter of fact, I put out a tweet, and some people were upset about it. I put out a tweet because some people were just were criticizing Pelosi for wearing the kente cloth around her neck when,
right.
And then, I wrote and I said, you know what, Dr. Leakey says, we all originated from Africa. So she has the right to wear it. She has the right to wear it. So,
Yeah, exactly right. I'm white only because my people, going way back centuries, they migrated to the northern countries where the white skin, as a result of exposure to sunlight. I mean, it was a protective coloration, if you will.
yes, yes. Well, that's a conversation for a different day that I definitely would like to flesh out, because I tell my students as a science teacher, there's no such thing as races. Our difference in complexion are due to environmental responses. So we are, if you look at the globe, you will see that the Earth is on a tilt, and folks who live closer to the equator are browner because they're literally closer to the sun. And folks who are not in direct line with the sun, so to speak, are of lighter complexion. So these are artificial constructs. So
Exactly.
one of the many reasons why I love science is because it factually brings us back together as one species, brings us back together as one species. Nevertheless, folks say that sometimes perception is reality. And so through literature, pop culture, history, folks create these type of social strata, and you create haves and have-nots based on various criteria, based on a variety of characteristics. And
Exactly.
so here it is in the United States, we have these artificial constructs that are being played out on many avenues, to the point that we have folks being killed by the police. And so I'd like to know, should we be optimistic about this social experiment called the United States? Because the United States is a social experiment. There are very few countries on the planet that can talk about receiving folks from all over the world and giving them an opportunity to join a capitalist system to make something of themselves, to be able to elevate their standard of living. So is this a sustainable model? Because every time we make several steps forward, then we have a few steps back, such as George Floyd, Amadou Diallo, Rodney King, and many of the sorts. So you and I both know that there's no such thing as Black and white people. We know that. We know that scientifically, we know that intellectually. However, socially, the United States is still very much divided. And to boot, we have somebody at the White House who is not trying to do anything about it, maybe even perpetuate it. So talk to us about your view as to where we're at today.
Well, let's go back to President Obama. When he was elected, the day he was elected, everybody said, this is going to be a great change, and that racism was going to be finished and whatever. It wasn't, unfortunately. But I did see some, at least status quo during those years. And then things began to change for the worse in 2016. Again, with the presidential campaign, and then with the election and everything else. And I think that the current administration has done more damage to racial relations, probably going clear back to Andrew Johnson, perhaps, and the Jim Crow laws or something else like that. I think he has been just as disastrous. Now, we have had other racial presidents down through the years, but I don't think none of them have ever steered the pot as much as the current administration has. I mean, he actually preaches to the extreme right wing that believe in separation of the races. And of
By,
course,
by, by the way, we have a listener, Brenda Jackson says South Carolina police is beating someone as we speak. So I don't know, maybe there's an element of the public who feels emboldened, right? Maybe they feel emboldened by the presence of who's in office.
yeah, absolutely. There's been a large gain in the number of white supremacist groups in this country since 2016. And of course, I really believe that, well, they're domestic terrorists, but they're the ones who come forward with, with their red hats on, and they run around the hills in camouflaged clothing, and they carry their guns and playing soldier. And I don't know why they have this. Of course, they carry Nazi flags and all of those things, a Confederate flag. I don't know what society they're living in or what world they're living in, that they believe that is right. And they say that let's take America back to the way it was. Well, why? I don't understand it. Take it back to what? You look at every generation, there have been problems between the races. The Europeans against the Native American Indians were here all the way down through. And then after that, then since 1619, slavery, brought to this country. And even after the slaves were freed by the 14th Amendment, 1868, then all of a sudden, where do those people go? There was no planning for it or anything else, and getting jobs, taking that. And in fact, when President Franklin Roosevelt put in the National Workers, what was the NRA? Not NRA. Yeah, I think it was National Recovery Act. Yeah, there was no provision in there for Black workers. Also in the Social Security Act, it basically, both of those basically exempted Black people. So we have had racist presidents down through the years. Woodrow Wilson, for example, though he was an academic, one thing or another, he was not only racist, but he was also, a follower, if you will, of the founding or the national, the German National Democratic Party, and down through there. But I have never seen any president be so willful in instigating racial division that I have in these last 3 years or 4 years. I think this is the heart of our problem right now. And then when we're talking about police and racial matters, a number of things on that. Let me read something to you. It'll take me just a second if you don't mind.
Okay, go right ahead.
Talking about this.
This is from your book?
Yes.
And please hold up your book so that everybody can see it, the cover again. Fear, Society, and
It looks like it comes up backwards there.
yeah, Fear, Society, and the Police. Yeah, Dale
Right.
and June. And you said this is your this is your 13th book?
13th, right. Turn to it here real quick, I think.
And your other books have been on the same subjects or in different subjects?
No, they have been basically, yeah, here it is. They have been basically about doing high-level personal protection security, like introduction to executive protection and things like that, security.
Okay.
This is the first time I've gone into the social aspect.
Okay.
But See, I believe, and I found this through research, but then I really thought about it and believe it, that even in police work, not only police work, but in other occupations also, we actually go by 5-year segments in our evolution of our job.
Mhm.
And basically in this, what I was talking about here, that when a police officer first starts, he's very, very enthusiastic.
Mhm.
He wants to impress people. He's there for one reason. He's idealistic, and his idea is to help others, people in need.
Mhm.
And then as he goes on in his career, this is where I think it should be important. In his in the second 5 years, he no longer takes unnecessary risk and no longer fearless nor invincible. He approaches to a situation as cautious and defensive, but feels he has to prove he is still able to physically subdue any offender, sometimes reacting with excessive and unnecessary force, showing he is unafraid. Then going from 10 to 15 years, this is where he becomes even more cynical and disillusioned. And he may often have a drink or two while on a job. He becomes depressed and reacts with anger, quickly taking it out on the douchebags, punks, mopes, scumbags, hookers, druggies, and freeloaders. His disillusionment and cynicism make him feel unappreciated. Racism and sexism become rampant, becoming part of his personality. And so when you look at the length of time that the police officers who have been involved in these beatings and whatnot, they're usually not within the first 5 years. It's usually after the first 5 years,
After some sense of what? After they either feel comfortable or they feel like maybe they will not make a difference in the world?
Well, they become cynical. Yeah, because, the whole thing is, it's like this. I spent weeks, months, years investigating this case, and he got off on a technicality. So what? A police officer, he does his job, he takes it before the bar of justice, and his job is finished. It doesn't matter what the judge says or whatever. If the judge in the court says he's not guilty or whatever, that should be the end of it. But it's not.
Mr. June, at one point, pardon me for interrupting, at what point in your development as a human being, as an American, that you decided to take a stand and started vocalizing the wrongs of America?
Okay, I'll tell you a story that I haven't told before. I've never voiced it or anything else. So this will be a first. It's a mea culpa, if you will. Okay. First off, I was young when I was a police officer. I mean, I was 21, but I looked like I was 16. And those years, it seemed like I got into a fight almost every night with somebody, for non-compliance or whatever it was. I was quick to jump in. I was one of those. And then one night when I was working as jailer, the deputies brought in a Mexican American drunk. And of course, it was my job to search him. And so I had him put his hands up on the wall, stretch his legs out back and way back. And so the fact that he was only supporting himself only by his fingertips. And then of course I had in the proper position on there, I had my foot down by his so that if he should do anything, it's just easy to kick it out. Well, he started to do something and yes, boom, I kicked his foot out and he fell face down on the concrete floor. Then, to make it even worse, I kicked him in the ribs and broke a rib. And I have felt ashamed from that day on. Now, at that time, I was only 23.
But why do you think you did that? Why do you think you did that? Where did that come from?
That's a good question. And that came again because I was so young. As I said, I looked 16 and I needed, I might have felt that I needed to prove something to the other deputies, that I was as tough as they were or whatever. And so I did that. And as soon as I did that, and I realized, wait a minute, he's a family man and all this. And so I vowed from that day on that I would never intentionally harm another person who was a prisoner or who was in my custody or whatever. I actually at one time, and I may have told you this story, but another time when I was on the police department, I actually faced down a person with a shotgun. And I could have very easily have pulled the trigger on my gun and shot him. But I have all my life.
Was that person of a different race?
Yes, he was Black. And this is when I was working that district I was telling you about. And well, what it was we got a call about 10 o'clock at night to a house in this area of a family domestic disturbance. So as we got there, this man about in his 50s came running out of the house with a shotgun in his hand. He ran around behind the house, and my partner went around to try to cut him off in the alley, and I followed him into the backyard. You know, it was dark. The only light there was the ambient light from a lamppost in the alley. And he ran down there and he got to this 8-foot fence that he ran to in the back of the backyard. And he stood there with a shotgun in his hand. And he was holding it like this. It poured out. He was holding it like this and he was facing me. And I'm standing there in his yard with my flashlight out like this, my 357 pointed like this, and my entire vision closed down just like this. And so all I could see was that right there, this part of his chest and his face. Mm-hmm. And I had a hair trigger on my pistol. And all I had to do basically was just to breathe hard and the round would go off. And I told him, I said, and this is the voice I used, I said, drop the gun. He didn't. Again, I said, drop the gun. He did. One more time. I said, drop the gun now. Now, I'm thinking, he's holding the gun like this. In order for him to shoot me, he's got to bring it down like this.
Right.
Exactly. That was a thought that went through my head. And so I figured that once he did that, once he started to move, I could shoot, or I could even move myself a little bit. And so he dropped the gun. My partner came and joined me. We picked up the gun, looked at it. It was empty. The number one rule is that all guns are always loaded. And the number two rule is that you never pull a gun unless you intend to use it. So 2 rules I broke that night. And I have been thankful all my life that I never did. What had happened was this man and his wife were having a acrimonious, if you will, a separation and divorce. Mm-hmm. That was a shotgun that his grandfather had given him, and he wanted it back, and she refused to give it to him. And that's what the whole fight was about. But I could have easily that night shot him. And
for no reason, for no justifiable reason.
There was none. I believe when somebody says, and I've said this to you before, that if somebody says, I was afraid for my life, they are in the wrong business. They shouldn't be there. You know, and that thought never occurred to me that night.
How old were you then?
By that time I was 24 or 25. Yeah, because I went to work for the government when I was 26. So yeah, I must have been about 25. And you know, as I say, I'm just glad I didn't. And another time in my own civilian life later on, I faced down a kid that he looked like he was about 16 that popped up from behind a car. I was in a parking garage and he popped up from behind a car. And this was a young a black school kid. And he popped up and he had a gun and he pointed it like this and he was holding it like this. So I knew he had done this before. I mean, it wasn't sticking out here like this, but he was holding it back here and he's standing sideways. And he said, "Give me all your money." Well, I had my briefcase with me where I had just gotten off duty. I was in civilian clothes. I just gotten off duty and I had my briefcase with me, but where at that time I used to carry my gun in my briefcase. But for some reason that day I had left my gun in the hotel room where I was staying. And of course, when he popped up and said that, and I was putting my briefcase into the car, when he said that, the first thought that came to my mind, the very first thought was, "Oh shit, I left my gun in the room." That was the first thought that came to me. So again, I literally talked him out of robbing me. Last thing he said when he went running away, he says, "Don't call the police." Well, of course, that's the first thing I did. But
he was about how old?
About 16.
So at that time, and I like that you said that you talked him out of it, because my guess is that nowadays a lot of cops would have just shot him, and we would have another dead young black guy on our hands.
That's the point. That's the point I was going to make. If I'd had my gun with me, his mother would have been crying that night, and maybe my wife would have been crying that night too.
You think you would have shot him?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I'm just glad that it worked out the way that it did.
At that time, was there time and energy spent on de-escalation tactics?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I did. I said, "Hey, you know what? You're really robbing the wrong person. I don't have any money. I'm just as broke and poor as you are."
Right.
And I gave him some change that I had in my pocket, and of course, then he wanted to see my wallet, and of course, I just happened that day to have $100 bill in it, but it was all folded up real small, so he didn't see it. So I said, "Look, I don't have any money either." I said that I never have any money. I said, "I've been poor all my life and I'll probably be that way," which is true. It worked out. But anyway, he said that. Now when I gave him the change, I gave it to him like this. He and I put it in his hand. Well, it happened that I carried a small penknife, and as I did that, the small, I mean. It was ridiculous, but my penknife was in his hand. And so what I did was, his hand was like this. I went and snapped it out of his hand, said, "That's mine." I'm keeping it.
So this is a conversation for another day, because the reason by which a young 16-year-old would come to anybody and say, "Give me your money," is not because he as an individual is inherently bad, but it's probably because he just may be hungry.
That was probably it. I know the school had just gotten out, and I know that he was probably walking home from school, but of course he was carrying a gun while he was coming home from school. But that wasn't the situation. I think he just saw me, by coming out of the hotel there. I think he saw me as perhaps a salesman or something, whatever it was. But I was really glad that it worked out the way that it did.
If you had the opportunity to speak to the President of the United States regarding race relations, what would you say to him?
Oh, wow. I don't think I could convince him of anything. I have had conversations with presidents before, and we've had some very good intellectual conversations, but this president, I don't think that he would listen to anybody, or he couldn't be convinced. There are people there in his in his cabinet or in his circle who are much, much smarter than I, and who have also approached him, I'm sure, about all of this. And I wouldn't have been able to convince him of anything.
Okay, so let me ask it in a different way. What is your hope for America with regards to race relations?
Well, the forecast is that by 2040, the whites will no longer be a majority race.
So in 40 years, white Americans, such as yourself, Caucasian Americans, will no longer be majority.
Right. Because really because of the influx from South America and Central America, because that is the next leading immigration population coming here. But of course, in those years, those 40 years, I will probably be dead. I might be an old person by that time.
Not my wish, not my wish. I'd love for you to live forever.
But well, you know, I do have a goal, at least 100. That's still a long way away.
If you don't mind me asking, how old are you now?
Oh God. I know I look old. Well, when I go to bed at night, I look in the mirror and say, boy, look at that 25-year-old stud.
Right.
And then when I wake up in the morning and I go to bed and say, who replaced that body with an old man's and beat him with an ugly stick?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So today you have children. How many children do you have?
Actually, I've got 5. And they're all grown.
They're all grown.
Right.
And what do you have conversations about race with your children?
Well, you know, interesting.
How old are they, by the way?
God, you asked me a math question, didn't you? Well, they've all got their own families, put it that way. But when my youngest daughter was a teenager, and of course, she right from day one she was born, she marched to her own drum. You know, she was a free spirit. She went as the wind blew her and everything else. Good girl. I mean, she's just really terrific. But she came home one day with a black boyfriend. How did I handle that? I said, well, welcome, come on in and have a cup of tea with us.
Awesome.
And it went well. It went very well. The only thing that I didn't like him was that I found out later that he was, and that she ditched him for this too, was the fact that he was basically a criminal, a crook.
Okay.
And that was the only thing. But his skin color didn't matter at all.
Was not an issue. So today, 2020, do you have what's called a multiracial family?
I guess, you know, just by looking at my cousin and her son, and by the way, her son grew up to be a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Okay, so your children, did any of them marry non-white individuals?
No, they all married white people. And they're very well off. I have a daughter who's a PhD. I have one who is a general manager of a big restaurant.
There's something happening. There's something that's suddenly happening when it comes to sound. I'm not sure if you hear it. There's some sort of a buzz.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't hear it.
Okay, well, I hear it only when you're speaking, so I don't know.
Oh, so it's probably my mic for some reason. Can you hear me enough to finish this, or?
Yes, I can hear enough to finish. We will close because we've been on for an hour, and I really thank you for your time. So, in closing, author Dale June on policing with communities of color, what would be your hope? What would be your hope? And when I say what would be your hope, this is something I would like both of us to continue to work on, whereby if we have to write a book together, if we have to do presentations together and remind humanity that we're one group of people. And I'm not sure if the problem is Black and white versus green. I'm not sure if it's socioeconomics versus color in this country. And so what would be your hope for America in closing?
Well, one thing I think that we should consider privilege. Privilege, especially white privilege, has been in the forefront for a long period of time. And take just a minute here, if I may. This is a drawing that I made that explains the justice system to me. It's called, I call it the train of justice. And many people are arrested. And then many people get off the cars right away with no charges or whatever, usually white privilege. And then it goes to the arraignment. And the arraignment, other people get off, maybe with a fine or something else like this. And as it goes along, then there's the preliminary, more people get out. And then there's the trial, other people get out. But who ends up in prison? The people who end up in prison, this is who by statistics, this is who the typical criminal is. He's Black or brown, from inner city, uneducated, unemployed, and poor. And the reason for that is white privilege along the way because of the, sometimes just because of the color of their skin, but also because most of them who get off can afford an attorney. The Black and brown, because of their economic status or whatever it may be, they have to go with a public defender who gets the case as it goes to court. And they may not even have passed the bar exam yet. And so I would like to see sometime the equality and justice. That's what I'd like to see. And to do away with this white privilege idea.
That is wonderful. Mr. Dale June, author of, please hold up your book again. Author of Fear, Society, and the Police by Mr. Dale L. June. We just had a long, I guess, some sort of a visit to his upbringing and his experience as a mainstream American, and to talk about where we are in the country today. Today is Friday, June the 12th. At approximately, 5 o'clock my time, which would make it, about 2 o'clock your time?
2 o'clock, yes, sir.
So about your time in California. I cannot thank you sufficiently because you've given me your most valuable asset. You've given me your time. And I look at you and I see hope, because it's evidence that we do not have to subscribe to the narrative of blacks and whites not being able to get along. So we ought to be able to just continue the conversation so that all Americans can peacefully coexist, because we are here. I'm very proud to be of African descent. However, if I were to be brought back there, I don't know where to go. I don't have anybody I know. So, and I'm not sure you can go back to England, right? So, where your ancestors are from. So we are here today, and we must move forward as one human family and peacefully coexist. And I thank you for the contributions you're making to humanity. And maybe sometime I'll have you back again for a third time on the platform, but I thank you so very much.
Well, thank you so very, very much. You know, I try to express my own feelings as much as I can. I can't really say that I have lived the Black man's experience. I can only say that I have seen it only as an observer. But as from what I have observed, it has created my character enough to believe in the equality and the sameness of all.
That is very, very, very good news and sounds awesome to me. Well, there you have it, social media land interview with Mr. Dale June. And we're going to close out today, this Friday. Let's think about peace. Let's think about safety. Let's think about respect for one another as we live in America in 2020. My name is Ted Victor. I'm the founder of the Broward Social Network. And again, Mr. Dale June, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, sir. Take care, stay safe.
Likewise, likewise. I'm definitely trying to stay safe. Thank you. Take care.